Well, with that introduction, I encourage you to open your Bibles, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 25. If you're using one of the Pew Bibles, it is on page 234. 1 Samuel chapter 25, page 234. We are going to be talking about some roadblocks. But as we read in verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 25, we're going to hear about a major storyline that we have been following throughout the book of 1 Samuel that comes to a conclusion. And here's what it says. Verse 1. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Paran. For 24 chapters, one man has been the spiritual leader of the nation of Israel. And actually, because Samuel was on the scene before any of Israel's kings, for a while he kind of served in this dual role of both spiritual leader and political leader of the nation of Israel. And then, of course, Israel asked for a king, and God gave them a king, even though them asking for a king was like a slap in the face to God, because he was their king. Not to mention the fact that Samuel was their leader. It was kind of a slap in his face too, but God acquiesced, and he allowed Israel to have a king. And so he asked Samuel to go and anoint the guy who would be that king, which was King Saul. And as we have seen, Saul did not turn out to be a good king. So God told Samuel to go anoint another guy to be king, and that was David. God specifically chose David because he was a man after God's own heart. So as we have been observing David trying to be a leader after God's own heart, we realize that David has the chance to succeed Saul as king. Obviously, he's anointed to be the next king. But now with Samuel's passing, it is also very possible, because of David's heart for God, that he has a chance to succeed Samuel as kind of the new spiritual leader of the nation. Now, we haven't heard much about Samuel for many weeks, particularly because David emerged on the scene. But now with Samuel's passing, there's a vacancy in that spiritual leader category. Will David be able to fill that role? In the political leader category, there's still a king. Saul is still the king. And he is doing his best to try and eliminate David. Saul doesn't want David to fill any leadership role. So here we are in chapter 25. And Samuel has died. What we're going to see in chapter 25 is that even though we are in this period where Saul is trying to kill David, Saul is not mentioned at all. Instead, David faces a very different roadblock. A roadblock that could easily stop him from becoming the spiritual and political leader of Israel that God has anointed him to be. And so after mentioning Samuel's passing there in verse 1, we read that David is on the move again. And that's no surprise. He and his men are fugitives from Saul. They're constantly moving, trying to avoid getting caught. Now he's in the desert of Paran. And that's when he comes up against the roadblock. So let's read about this roadblock in verses 2 through 13. A certain man named in Maon, who had property there at Carmel, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you. Good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them. And the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, Be favorable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal the message in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" David's men turned around and went back. David said to his men, when they arrived and reported every word, David said, "Each of you strap on your sword." So they did, and David strapped his on as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. Did you see the roadblock? The roadblock to David's progress, becoming the new spiritual and political leader of Israel? Nabal, right? We could call him Nabal the fool, because in Hebrew, his word literally means fool or foolish one. Which, can you imagine any parents choosing to name their kids the foolish one? I went to high school with a girl whose name was Barbara, and her last name was Wire. Barb Wire. I kid you not. That's a true story. But barbed wire wasn't anything like barbed wire. It seems, though, that Nabal just might have an appropriate name for his personality and his attitude. He is a roadblock for sure. But here's what I want you to think about. Even though Nabal is definitely a roadblock to David, he is not the roadblock that I want us to notice. Nabal is not the roadblock that I want us to really think deeply about as far as David becoming the next political and spiritual leader of Israel. The roadblock I want us to look at is much more serious. And we heard it in the verses that I just read. It's kind of hidden, though, I'll have to admit. But let's take a look at those verses and see if actually both roadblocks will emerge. One is minor, that's Nabal, and the one is major. Now remember, David and his men are fugitives. They're being hunted by King Saul, and because of that, they need food and supplies. I want you to think about this for a minute. What is the largest number of people that you have ever been responsible for feeding? Maybe at a wedding, maybe at a funeral. That can get up to a couple hundred people. Sometimes you might say, yeah, I one time had to plan a meal for 200 people. That would be a huge meal, right? Well, David's army has 600 men, and they have to eat every day. This is why, if you're thinking in military terms, a supply chain that is dependable and consistent is absolutely essential. I can't fathom what it must take to feed a modern military of 10,000 or 100,000 people. It's unbelievable. David and his men, they're only 600, but they have a uniquely difficult situation because they're fugitives. It's not like they can just walk into Costco and get those giant packs of meat and be fine. They're going to be spotted if they do that. And as we have learned in the previous two sermons, Saul has people all over the place who are watching for David and reporting back to him. I saw David here. I saw David there. So David and his men have to be extremely cautious about when they reveal themselves. They're working carefully to develop relationships with people who are living near their hiding spots, hoping to earn their trust, and then hoping to earn the favor of those people. And that's what gives David the idea to reach out to this guy, Nabal. David and his men just need to eat. And Nabal is rich. He's at the point in the season where he is shearing or slaughtering some of his sheep, and it's very festive. It's the perfect time for him to be able to help out David. We also learned in this passage that David and his men had provided protection and treated Nabal's men very well. Even though they're fugitives, they never stole from them like they could have. So Nabal is a roadblock. He's not the major roadblock that we're going to be looking for, but he is a roadblock to David because he refuses to help David. Have you ever met or heard about people like Nabal? People who are both rich and selfish? Some people are very disagreeable people, and yet they have loads of money. Now, to be fair, there are people who do not have loads of money who are also very selfish, right? And there are wealthy people who are exceedingly generous. It just so happens that Nabal is one of those people who has a lot of money and he's very selfish and disagreeable about it. He's foolish, just like his name. But maybe Nabal actually has good reason for being a little bit hardcore. Think about it. Word is out around the country that King Saul is trying to kill David, and he is more than willing to commit atrocities in his warpath. And so maybe Nabal is just simply thinking, I don't want that guy and his military anywhere near me and my household and my land. I don't even want Saul to find out that I might have helped David a little bit. It didn't go well for other people who did that. Or maybe Nabal is just selfish. Maybe he has one of those self-assured personalities that says, I worked hard for my money. I'm not giving it to some fugitive. No doubt, Nabal is a roadblock to David in the story. He doesn't agree with David's request. He makes life more difficult for David. I mean, imagine if he would have just said, sure, I'll feed your men, David. But he doesn't do that. He is a roadblock for David on David's journey to becoming the leader that God wants him to be. But like I said, there's a much more serious roadblock in this story. One that I think is much more capable of taking David down. And one reason that Nabal the fool is not that major roadblock in the story is because of his wife Abigail. She is so good. Isn't it interesting that Nabal the fool is married to Abigail the good? Look at verse 3. Such a contrast between husband and wife in this story. Nabal is surly and mean. Abigail is intelligent and beautiful. As I was reading this, I thought to myself, how did they end up together? You ever wonder that about some people where you're like, how did they get together? My goodness. But we don't know. All we know is that in these verses 1 through 13, she's beautiful, she's intelligent, and I will tell you, hint, she's about to steal the show. As we keep reading, we're going to see how Abigail is the one who identifies both the minor roadblock, which is her husband Nabal, and the major roadblock, and she works to remove both of them. But first we need to meet another character in the story. In verses 14 through 17, one of the servants in the household also seems to be very intelligent and very good. The servant reports to Abigail that Nabal has denied David's requests. This is a servant who all we know by the Hebrew is that it was a young man. No name. We don't know who this is. But he's a hero in this story. Even though he's never named, he shines. Look at how the servant describes Nabal in verse 17. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. You ever talked with people like Nabal, the know-it-all? They don't care. They believe they are right about all their many perspectives in the world, and that's it, period. My guess is you've talked with people like Nabal. Well, the servant seems to have observed Nabal doing this many times before, and he knows something. To his master's wife, she can do something about it. Because, as the verse says, he believes that disaster is hanging over his master and his whole household. And perhaps this young servant is thinking to himself, I better do something or else I and everybody else in this household could be in big trouble of retaliation from David. I want you to think about that. that. A no-name servant speaks up. Even if you're young, even if you think that your perspective doesn't matter, even if you think to yourself in the situations that you get into in life, they're never going to listen to me, I encourage you, if you see something, speak up. Never underestimate yourself. When you see wrong, speak out against it. In my email introducing the sermon on Friday, I talked about whistleblowers. This is the whistleblower in the story. This no-name servant, and he speaks up, and it changes everything. And after the servant speaks up to the wife, Abigail, we learn a lot more about her. The big question is she going to take this servant seriously? That disaster is hanging over the whole household? I mean, what's he talking about? Could this really be true? Look at verses 18 to 31. Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisin, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into the mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man, Nabal." She's talking about her husband here. He is just like his name, which means fool, and folly goes with him. "As for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent." She's talking about David. "And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my lord be like Nabal. And let this gift, which your servant has brought to my lord, be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my lord, because you fight the Lord's battles. And no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has fulfilled for my lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel." Again, she's talking to David about his own anointing to become king. She says, "My lord," essentially you, David, "will not have on your conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my lord success, remember your servant." It's a powerful speech. And in it, did you notice how Abigail deals with both the minor roadblock and the major one? What Abigail does in this is a masterclass in emotional intelligence. I kind of think she would have been an incredible ruler over the whole country. Her political, relational, communicational skills here are just astounding. Think about it. She's able to move fast. She is able to marshal the support of all the servants to gather up all this food. She keeps her husband totally in the dark, and she's able to rush out and ward off impending disaster, just like that. She's good. Now, she deals with the obvious roadblock first. And again, this is the minor roadblock, and that is the foolishness of her husband, Nabal. First of all, she just simply ignores his decision to not help David. They've been preparing, because this is a festive occasion, the shearing of the sheep and the slaughtering of the sheep. The whole community would essentially be having a county fair. And she gathers up all this food that has been prepared for the county fair. She loads it up on what to us would be like a bunch of food trucks and heads it out to David. In doing so, she removes the minor roadblock efficiently. But what about the second roadblock? The major roadblock that I've been talking about. Did you see it? Abigail does. She addresses it head on with this incredible combination of graciousness and bluntness. In fact, she's quite courageous. She is sticking her neck out to deal with the second roadblock. So I'm curious, does anyone have a guess of what the second roadblock is to David and his men? Anybody? Larry?
David strapped on his sword, and he was about to kill the people, these Nabal guys, and do something that was instantaneous without thinking.
That's right. That's it. Larry got it. David's decision to strap on his sword and go commit an atrocity. David is the major roadblock to himself. He is so angry at Nabal that he's about to take murderous action against Nabal. Whatever is going on inside David just erupts out of him, firing him up, taking his own anger out against Nabal. David himself is his own roadblock. Maybe you've experienced that before. We truly are our own worst enemies, aren't we? Sometimes. We can allow ourselves to think so wrongly when we become slighted, offended, hurt. And it can be so easy to just let self-control and gentleness and peace and goodness fly out the window when we feel like someone is mistreating us. If David gives in to these murderous thoughts that anger is motivating him to have, he will end up committing a huge sin. David himself is the roadblock to becoming what God has already anointed him to be, the future spiritual and political leader of Israel. But David doesn't even see it. He doesn't see his anger. He doesn't see his vengeance that way. He just simply thinks he's right. He is strapping on his sword. He is mustering his men to go and slaughter Nabal. David's all in on committing an atrocity that would be as evil as the atrocities that King Saul has already committed in his pursuit of David. Remember when King Saul slaughtered the priests? David doesn't see it in himself, but Abigail does. As does the servant who initially alerted Abigail. Remember, he said disaster is hanging over this household. He's like, David is on the warpath. This is not good. And so, Abigail demonstrates her genius thinking and communication skills. She wants David to open his eyes and see the roadblock in himself and deal with it. Because she knows the amazing potential of David. And she's afraid that the roadblock is going to keep him from becoming who God wants him to be. She's probably also really afraid that her entire livelihood and community is about to be decimated. She knows that how she handles David could have a major impact. She knows she has to remove the roadblock inside him. And so let's walk through Abigail's speech to look at the genius way that she deals with this. Because this is a super tense situation. David and his men are bearing down on their community. Now, I've already mentioned her quick thinking to gather up a ton of food. She motivated her servants. She kept her husband in the dark. But there is so much more to her diplomacy. In verse 20, take a look at her courage. She meets David face to face. In verse 23, she bows down to him, literally at his feet. In verse 24, she's pleading for pardon. In all of this, we see her humility and yet her courage. Then in verse 25, she does something genius. She apologizes for her husband's rudeness. And she shows that she is not trying to defend Nabal to David. She just simply says, he was wrong. I'm sorry, he was wrong. And then secondly, she also exonerates herself. It's not that he was wrong. I also wasn't there. Nabal did this on his own. She's very smart about this. In verse 26 then, she really dives in. She confronts David. She redirects David to God, pointing out how thus far God has kept David from bloodshed. This point is foundational to the case that Abigail is trying to make with David, as she really wants David to see himself. She wants David to see how he is, in this action, veering away from the righteousness that he has been following. And that if he continues veering away from God's way, he will enter into wickedness. And then after saying all of that, she's really starting to step on some toes with David. She says, and by the way, and she points over at all the food. I think that's just super wise timing on her part in verse 27. Because in verse 26, she has just confronted David. Now in verse 27, she's like, oh yeah, and now here's all the gift of food that I've given you. So that he doesn't have the chance of becoming really angry about the confrontation. Now, in that confrontation, she is clearly insinuating that David, if he continues his action to kill Nabal, he will no longer be remembering the Lord. And that's something that David could take great offense to. He could easily, at that moment, in verse 26, say, hold on, woman. You are accusing me of not remembering the Lord? Who do you think you are? How can you be accusing me of taking matters into my own hands? But before David can even get offended like that, she points out the food. She's solving the problem that started this in the first place. So she's really, really wise in how she's directing and redirecting David. But she's far from done. Look at verse 28. She knows she has stepped on his toes, so she asks for forgiveness. And then she affirms that she is convinced that God will not only make David the leader of the nation, but God will also give him a dynasty. She's basically saying, David, look at what God will do through you. She's really playing on his emotions and kind of buttering him up in the process. But notice the last phrase of verse 28. She says, no wrongdoing will be in you as long as you live. And in saying that, she's back to confronting him again. She's saying, David, there is impending wrongdoing here if you continue down this road. And that's the central point. If David takes action to kill Nabal and Nabal's men, it would be wrong. And Abigail wants him to see that as a massive roadblock to any future position that God has for him. And she's right. And now she's on a roll in verse 28. She just keeps it going through verses 29 to 31. In 29, she directs David again to think about the Lord's perspective. And notice the phrase she uses. Your enemies, he, the Lord, will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. At that point, when she said that, I wonder if David got a smile on his face. Abigail has just referred to David's iconic weapon of choice. The sling. Everyone in the whole nation would have known. He killed Goliath using a sling. And I wonder if David smiled and thought, okay, woman, I see what you're doing here. So Abigail is saying, not only using like direct words, but she is also using the imagery of the sling. David, she's saying, remember God. Remember how God used you to take down Goliath. She's saying, David, remember God's mission and God's methods. Do not do this evil thing. And then when God lifts you up to the throne, as he surely will, you will not have any evil on your conscience. And then she says, oh, and when that day comes, remember me too. She's so smart. You can see why the Bible calls her intelligent. She's quite the diplomat. And that brings us to verse 32. Here's the key question. How will David react? I've already said, I think he is smiling by the end of her talk. She's pointed out the major roadblock to David himself. She's removed the minor roadblock. It's gone. But she can't remove the major roadblock. That's within him. He's got to be the one to make that choice. And that roadblock is his fury, his desire for vengeance, his plan to not use God's method. Only David can choose to remove that. Only David can choose to get out of his own way. The key question is, will he? It's difficult, right? When we have built up this passionate rationale in our hearts and minds for why we are right and the other person is wrong, it's so hard to change our minds. We're furious, or maybe we're embarrassed. Maybe we're fearful. Maybe we're jealous. It can be so hard to change those emotions. Because when fear and embarrassment are raging through us, it is so difficult to see ourselves correctly. In those moments of heightened emotion, we do not think that we are the roadblock. We just simply think we're right. And it's the other person who's wrong. And it is amazing the very poor decisions that we can justify when we feel hurt and embarrassed and disrespected. What will David do? Look at verse 32. David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment, and for keeping me from bloodshed this day, and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." He chooses what is right. He listens to Abigail. He admits that he was wrong, that he was headed down a disastrous road. And therefore, we see how David is a man after God's own heart. It's really amazing what he chooses here. I mean, he is willing to publicly, in front of his men, admit his fault. He is willing, in front of his men, to change his course. That's difficult for any of us, right? I think it's more intense for David because as a man in a patriarchal society, listening to a woman, receiving correction from a woman, learning from a woman, just doesn't happen. This is super rare. And I wonder if any of David's men, when they're listening to him apologize and praise God for Abigail, are thinking to themselves, what are you doing? Listening to a woman? Let's go attack her foolish husband and get his food. Then again, they might have all been eating the food that Abigail brought, and they maybe weren't even listening to David at this point. Who knows? Still, it's very clear that if they wanted to, David could easily be viewed as a weak leader in this culture. The men could say he should not give in to diplomacy, especially diplomacy from a woman. They could very much be thinking what David himself said back in verse 22 initially. May God deal with me ever so severely if I don't kill them all. There is a cultural pressure on David to act like a man, act like a strong leader who does not allow anyone to disrespect them. And in verse 22, that is how David had responded initially. He even kind of brought God in to justify his choices and his behaviors. Like, God, basically saying, God help me, I'm about to just decimate these people. It was actually his own rage, though. It was actually his lack of self-control. And how often can you and I do the same thing, right? We can make it seem like God is on our side when our attitudes and our actions and our thinking are nothing like God. We can believe that we are right and use vindictive, warlike methods that do not resemble the fruit of the Spirit. We sometimes even believe that if we are pursuing God's mission, we don't need to use God's methods. You know what we call that? The ends justifying the means. But notice how David has changed his tune by verse 32. Praise be to the Lord who has sent me today. Because of Abigail's courage, her excellent logic, David finally sees the major roadblock is himself. He sees that his rage, his vengeance, was not of the Lord, but was flowing up from within his own sinful self. And David realizes now that in his pursuit of God's mission, he has gotten away from God's methods. Look at verse 34. In verse 34, David now invokes God as keeping him from committing evil. In this we see the total 180-degree change from verse 22 to verse 34. And it was all because Abigail stuck her neck out. Because of her courage, her quick thinking, her creative diplomacy, she has pointed out the major roadblock. It's David himself. And David then removed the roadblock. Disaster is averted. The unnamed servant and Abigail are the heroes of this story. And we learn that David and Abigail part ways in peace. But the story isn't done. It's kind of a surprise ending. Look at verses 36 to 44. When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he says, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife." She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, "I am your servant, and am ready to serve you and wash the feet of my Lord's servants." Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 female servants, went with David's messengers and became his wife. David had also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both were his wives. But Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltiel, son of Laish, who was from Galilee. So what we see is that both roadblocks are removed. Nabal, this wicked desire in David's heart, and David is then able to progress. Roadblocks removed, David can move forward to becoming who God wanted him and who God had promised him to be, the leader of all Israel. Now we learn a few details. Remember David's first wife? We just barely met her. It would have been a month or so ago in the story. It was Michal, King Saul's daughter. She actually helped David escape when Saul first started coming after him. Well, we learn in this passage that now that David is on the run, Saul steps in again and says, "I'm giving you to another husband." Very different culture in those days. So essentially, David is now single again, and he invites Abigail to marry him. She accepts. Is this the end of the story? No. We learn that David has also married another woman, Ahinoam. And we conclude our story there with what might actually be a little bit of a cliffhanger about the future. A reader might be reading this and question, wait a minute, David's married 3 times already? What? Why didn't David go and try and rescue his first wife, Michal? Did they actually get divorced? And then why is he marrying 2 more women? It's really odd, right? We start thinking, is this wrong? I thought David was a man after God's own heart. We're going to find out, yes, it is wrong. We're going to turn to this reality as David will marry multiple other women as well, leading to one of his major downfalls. For now, though, put a pin in it. This is just a little teaser of what is to come. I want us to think about this phrase. We sometimes need to get out of our own way. David was his own roadblock. He was absolutely convinced that he was heading to do the right thing by eliminating Nabal and his men. He was completely self-assured that this was right. And that self-assurance should cause us to pause and reflect on our lives. We, too, can be so self-assured that we are right, when in reality, we're wrong. For example, we can pursue God's mission, but use methods that are out of line with God's heart. That was really Abigail's major point to David. David, God has a great mission for you, but this warpath you are on in pursuit of that mission is wrong, and you don't want that on your conscience. What about us? In our contemporary society, there are Christians who put mission above method. For example, think about the mission of Jesus. The mission to go and make disciples of all nations. Or think about the mission of God's heart for justice, to eradicate injustice in society and produce human flourishing. These are important parts of God's mission for all of us. That's what we as disciples of Jesus are to be passionate about. But that doesn't mean that we can pursue his mission using any method that we want. Instead, we pursue the mission of Jesus using the methods of Jesus. And this is why we talk about the fruit of the Spirit so frequently. There are church leaders across our country who have made the news. It's so sad. And they've made the news not because they're pursuing the mission of Jesus using the fruit of the Spirit, but they're pursuing the mission of Jesus using aggressive styles that leave a trail of broken lives, employees, and people in their churches. You've heard me mention it, it's been many months now, but I encourage you, listen to the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Read the book, A Church Called Tove. They detail the wreckage and the carnage of church leaders who say that they're pursuing the mission of Jesus, but they have abandoned the method of Jesus. Read the book, Jesus and John Wayne, for how this mission at any cost philosophy is played out very negatively for contemporary Christians in our society. But most of all, I want you to take a minute and think about yourself. And I need to think about myself. What do you know of your own roadblocks within you? What tendencies to use methods that are not in line with the heart of God do you sometimes allow yourself to pursue? Is it possible that you might even have a roadblock or two that you're not aware of? And do you find it difficult to remove those roadblocks in your own life? The ones that you are aware of?
In becoming aware of those roadblocks in your own life so that you can not only pursue the mission of Jesus, but also do so using the method of Jesus. David had a major roadblock within himself, but he was still humble enough to listen to Abigail and evaluate, is she right? That means David was teachable. Having a teachable heart is vital if we are to become the people that God wants us to be. And so I ask you today, will you be both that bold whistleblower like Abigail and the servant to speak the truth? And will you be like David, to have that humility and that teachability, to allow the whistleblowers to speak into your life so that the roadblocks can be removed as you pursue the mission of Jesus using his methods?